All right, well, welcome everybody. It's so good to see you all. I want to turn it over to Sergio, who will be facilitating our class discussion tonight. So, Sergio?
Thank you, Lama Matt. Good evening, everyone. It's so good to gather together um, tonight. And I'm really hoping to hear from all of you, or as many of you as will be willing to chat tonight. But as we've been reading and practicing together, I think the great benefit is when we share in each other's practice and in each other's insights and questions. Um, I always find so much benefit in hearing what others have to say about their practice, and that's how we build and develop our sense of sangha, especially in these days when we have to meet online. Um, so I'm very happy to be here and looking forward to spending this time together. In a couple minutes, we're going to watch the video of Thupten Jinpa. Um, you may have already watched it, but I think it'll be a good experience to watch it together. And so the way we're going to use our time tonight is we're going to watch that video, and then we're going to break out into a few smaller groups to discuss both from the video, but also from the reading. The video is very much tied to this chapter, so there's a lot of overlap there. But it's always really lovely to hear it in Thupten Jinpa's own words and voice. So we're going to watch the video, we're going to discuss in smaller groups, and then we're going to come back and report some of our conversations. And also that'll be a time to talk about our practice, how things are going, how the practice of self-compassion is developing for you this week, and perhaps any questions or concerns or insights that you might like to share. So we will start with the video if Lama Matt, you would be kind enough to get that going for us.
Among my Buddhist studies colleague, there's a debate, and some of the Buddhist studies, scholars say that self-compassion is an oxymoron because compassion by its very definition presupposes it's a compassion for someone else. And built in the Buddhist definition of compassion is actually that, it's a sense of concern for the well-being or the need of someone else. But on the other hand, there is also in Buddhism an assumption that that expression of compassion really comes from a sense of compassion for yourself. So, and the analogy given here is that because compassion is primarily defined in terms of a response to the sight of a suffering, and loving kindness is defined in terms of wishing happiness for others. So they're seen as two sides of the same coin. If you're focusing more on someone's happiness, it's loving kindness. But if your response has been triggered by the sight of someone's pain, it expresses as compassion. So there is this suggestion that having a compassion, genuine compassion, presupposes some ability to care for yourself. Because if you don't have that ability to care for your own needs and suffering, then you don't have a point of reference. So in that sense, self-care, instinct for self-care is a presupposition of all sentient creatures from the Buddhist point of view. And this is one of the reasons why Buddhist teachers on the whole find this idea of self-compassion problematic, because the need to cultivate self-compassion, it's not so much self-compassion is problematic, but the need to cultivate it is found to be problematic, because there is an assumption that actually instinct for self-care is there even in animals. And the other day, His Holiness was talking with some mind and life, scientists that were briefing him on the curriculum that we are developing on teaching secular ethics and compassion to children. And one component of that is self-care and self-compassion. And His Holiness said, well, this idea that you have to somehow cultivate self-compassion, he says it doesn't make sense. He said, even a cat, when the cat feels that somehow it's been soiled, it will lick itself to clean. The instinct for self-care is built there in a sentient, nature. And so we started, having discussion, and then His Holiness said, maybe what you are saying is that you need to cultivate a wiser self-compassion, a wiser approach to self-care. And probably that's one way of thinking about it, because in the West, one of the problems is, and it's very difficult at this point, and I mean, there is one of the greatest experts on self-compassion is Christian Neff. She is a psychologist from Texas University. She's the person who has brought concept of self-compassion in scientific domain and as a field of scientific study. And I had conversations with her, and she was telling me that it's not so much East versus West. She has developed a self-compassion scale, and when this scale was used in different countries, and there's a paper that came out where she compared US, Taiwan, and Thailand. And I think South Korea was in that too. Thailand scored highest. They're best on that score. And US and Taiwan were actually, US scored better than Taiwan. And Taiwan is an Asian country. So she says that it's not so much East versus West. There's something more than that going on. But whatever it is, in a more affluent, developed, competitive society, self-compassion seems to be a challenge. And and part of that probably has to do with cultural heritage. It may have something to do with the guilt concept of the Western culture, but at the same time, probably it has more to do with the competitive nature of our society. We are constantly driven to prove ourselves. So our sense of self-worth is tied to our performance. And probably parenting also plays into this, because we reward when children, do something good, and we praise them when they achieve something, and we show our disappointment when they come back with a bad score, I mean, it's very human, but in a competitive culture, it's probably even worse. And that probably builds up a kind of a self-to-self relationship, a self-image in the child that constantly seeks approval for one's own sense of self. So it's a more complicated problem. And so that's why, for example, at the 8-week compassion training program that I developed at Stanford, out of the 8-week, 2 weeks are dedicated to self-compassion, because otherwise it becomes such a stumbling block that the course participants are not able to move on. And it's, in some sense, it's almost like a kind of a reparenting. So, and I suppose this has to do with, I don't think it's just Christian or kind of Judeo-Christian heritage of the West. It probably has more to do with the competitive nature of our upbringing. And maybe my interpretation of this is wrong, but in any case, when our children were growing up, of course, we want them to do their chores, but I begged my wife to, go with me so that we don't, link, quid for quo. What's the expression? Quid for quo, yeah? Quid pro quo. Anyway, it doesn't come out. Because I said, I don't want to reward them for doing chores. I said, we will come out with understanding that they will be, once they get to a certain age, they will have a pocket money, because they now have to go and after grade 8, 9, high school, they have to go and be able to buy things and be with their friends. They will have a weekly allowance, but we will expect them to do certain chores, but we are not going to pay them for doing chores. And it's a different style of parenting. And also we wanted to make sure that our love was not conditional upon anything. So, I mean, you know, of course we tried, but we don't know. It's the result we'll see. And I'm sure they're going to blame something on us when they grow up. But I think it has probably more to do with the competitive nature of the society. And so I think this is why compassion training practice with a self-compassion type really makes a big difference, because in the end, the core dimension of self-compassion is a genuine ability for self-acceptance and able to really kind of be a friend to yourself, you know, and that is tough. Whereas people coming from the, you know, kind of particularly from the Buddhist culture, because of the belief in karma and all the rest, people's sense of worth is not really tied, self-image is not tied to how they perform. But they may not have self-confidence that the Western, you know, kind of people who grew up in the West have, but they don't have a low self-compassion. So it's an interesting problem, actually. Yeah, it's an interesting issue. Yeah.
Do you distinguish between self-compassion and understanding your own suffering? Is there, can we distinguish them?
Yeah.
Are they separate? Are they interlinked?
Well, they are connected because, you know, you have to, you know, a genuine self-compassion involves being able to, you know, approach your own understanding with acceptance and non-judgment, and somehow being able to relate to it with kind of a kindness. So it's sort of, genuine self-compassion presupposes that you are able to do that. Yeah.
Thank you, Lama Matt. I have 4 questions that I would like to share with all of you for discussion in your groups. I don't expect you all to discuss all 4 of the questions. There's not enough time for that. The idea is that you will read these questions and then see which one you want to address. And so there might be 4 persons per group, and there, you might get to hear about all 4 of these. So Lama Matt, should I send these in the chat before we do breakout rooms or after we do breakout rooms?
Yeah, put them in the chat now.
Okay. So I'll put them in the chat and I'll read them for us to kind of, so we're all on the same page here. So the first question that you might want to address is, why do some Buddhist thinkers find self-compassion to be an oxymoron? How is compassion for others implied in self-compassion? So that's one. The second is, what does His Holiness the Dalai Lama mean when he says perhaps what we need is a wiser self-compassion? Number 3 is, what does Thupten Jinpa mean when he says we almost need reparenting when it comes to self-compassion? And finally, this is a direct quote from page 37. Many people believe that unless they are critical and demanding of themselves, they will be failures, unworthy of recognition and undeserving of love. And so the question here is, how do you relate to this statement? Is this true for you? Has this been your experience? Is this something that you are working on, or perhaps you haven't noticed? So these are the 4 questions. So we're going to break out into rooms. I think, Lama Matt, if we have maybe 4 or 5.
Yeah, so we're doing 5 rooms. That way there's 4 participants per room.
And again, don't feel like you have to discuss all of these questions. Just choose the one that speaks more to you tonight that you want to talk about.
And I think because we do have quite a few questions, and they're really great questions that hopefully will spark some dialogue. What are we thinking? Maybe 20 minutes for breakout rooms?
Okay. I think that sounds good. Yeah.
All right. So I, just as in previous weeks, I'm going to send you all to the rooms, and then you'll get a prompt on your screen if you can accept, and that will then take you to your room, and then we'll start 20 minutes, so about 8:30 will be the time that we come back. Okay,
Are we all here now?
we are back.
Okay, great. Welcome back. I hope that your conversations were as rich as our conversation in our small group. That was very enjoyable. I think what I would love for us to do is to spend just a few minutes, and I failed to say this before we broke out, but if you could choose from your group one spokesperson to kind of give us a brief or some of the highlights from your group, and it doesn't have to be very long, but maybe something that really stood out to your group or that you would like to share with the larger group. Let's see, do we have any volunteers to go first? Anybody would like to be a spokesperson for one of your groups? Okay, while you're thinking about it, we'll go ahead and start with our group, and our spokesperson is Lauren. So.
Okay. So I'm just kind of look at the questions one more time just to jog my memory. So our group talked, one thing we just recently were just discussing about this, and maybe you can help me remember, Sergio, but this kind of pathological altruism, this notion that is shared in there that people who maybe don't have self-compassion can still act compassionately, but understanding kind of the root of that, is it from a place of feeling lack and grasping, or is it from a sort of place of having your cup full? And I think, psychology has terms around codependency and things like that. And maybe the actions at some point might be the same, but there is a distinction, perhaps, maybe not sometimes in the result. Somebody might still receive benefit, but from the other side, there could be a distinction around a person having a full cup, feeling compassion for themselves enough to give to others. So we discussed that within question number 4 a bit. And let's see, a couple of other things that stood out, and I'm happy if my teammates want to talk a little bit more about other things I missed, but we talked a lot about, we really liked the RAIN exercise from this week, and just how working with experiencing our emotions and watching how we add on these stories when we're having them, and how that affects our levels of self-compassion. So we really reflected on that and talked about our experiences with working with emotion in that way. So that was part of it. And talked a little bit about the reparenting piece as well, like that we might not have had that modeled for us. And so how can we then become models for that, or learn that in our lives in order to act with more compassion towards ourselves and others? And so that does sort of have a reparenting. Anybody else from my group? Is there anything else that I missed, or anything else you want to add?
I think that's pretty good.
Okay, I did my best.
Yeah, those are definitely some of the highlights. Let's see, do we have a representative from Jason's group? Doesn't have to be Jason, just somebody from Jason's group.
Well, I'm willing to share unless there's anybody else in the group that would like to, but so I think this is one of the things I had mentioned that I found interesting is we talked about number 4. A lot of our culture and our jobs kind of press us to come up with kind of our next achievements and our next things that are going to prove that we're worthy and that we're, we can be compassionate towards ourselves if we hit that 6-month goal or that 5-year goal or something like that. So I think in our culture, it's kind of ingrained in us to not quite be compassionate up front unless we've met some criteria. So I think it's kind of an interesting that we're talking about this. We'd also talked about giving ourselves space to be compassionate for ourselves, being caring enough of ourselves that little things like if you need a nap, if you need space, from the family for a little bit, if you need whatever it is you need, and of course, probably within limits, but whatever it is you need to um, find that extra energy to where you can be compassionate to yourselves, and then you can be, compassionate towards others because you've sort of developed that. There's a lot of things I think in our culture that would be frowned upon if you're just sitting on the couch for 5 hours. Well, maybe you need that 5 hours to sit on the couch and watch TV to be compassionate, and that's probably a better version of yourself than if you hadn't done that. So those were a few things we kind of talked about, but anybody else in the group have anything else to add? I could ramble for 5 more minutes if we need to, but
Well, if you want to think about it for a minute, we can move on to another group. Let's see, the group that had Gabi, Leslie, Masha, and Hans. Would one of you like to speak for some of the highlights in your room? And I'm happy to volunteer someone.
Okay, I'll do it.
Yay.
So one of the things that we talked about was just the influence capitalism has on how we view things. Just the emphasis on getting stuff, amassing things, amassing wealth, the competition, sort of the dog eat dog sort of mentality. Let's see, what else did we talk about? One thing when I read the chapter, and this might be, I don't know, a little controversial, I don't know, but I couldn't help but thinking about the trend of not keeping score at kids, like soccer matches and basketball games. And I feel like it's like the other side of the same coin of like that competition, like you only get a trophy if you win, but no matter what you do, you get a trophy, is the other side of the coin. And I just don't know if that is conducive to developing a sense of self-compassion and compassion, because it's like no matter your actions, you get a reward too. So it feels kind of like the same result in the end. I don't know if that makes sense. Masha, Gabi, what else did we talk about? Dive in.
I think what you just said is really insightful and very thought-provoking. Because there's a part of not keeping score that is very appealing to me. And at the same time, I think, how do you practice right effort, right? Without really looking for ways to improve yourself. So it feels, what you're describing feels like, it's still dualism if you're just going to the other extreme. That's really interesting. I'm going to think about that for a while.
Yeah, and also kind of made me think about what they call in education the growth mindset, which is like, it's fine if like you are measuring almost against yourself, which is a way to grow, right? But it's not like, oh, well, you didn't get an A and so you failed. Like, okay, last time you got a C, you tried harder, you got a B this time. That's growth, right? And so there's just a way to kind of measure effort there that's not like judgmental as far as whether you did it or you didn't do it. It's whether or not you feel like you put in an effort. So anyway, just connections with other sorts of concepts.
Much to think about there.
Let's see. Masha is unmuted. I didn't know if she wanted to share.
Oh.
No, I didn't have anything. I was just going to compliment Leslie.
Yeah, that was great. Okay, group 3 had Andrew, Derek, Patty, and Terry. Would one of you like to speak for your group?
I volunteered Derek because he was very eloquent in the way that he spoke, and I really appreciated, in particular, the reorienting. Go, Derek.
No pressure.
If you know me, you know I love the sound of my own voice already, so it's a struggle. Thank you, Patty, for creating an opportunity for me to be mindful and try and grow without yammering on. Yeah, I felt like we had a really, really good conversation. You know, there was part of the reading where he was talking about, you know, that a lot of these traditional practices, you know, start with the self, right? With the idea that that's the base point, because, you know, self-compassion is sort of just an assumed thing in some, you know, it makes sense, you know, in some cultures, and that with the world that we live in today, that can be a difficult thing, you know. And some of us talked about our own experiences, you know, sort of. I know for myself, I don't start with myself. I start with my nephew, because the relationship that I have with him is very easy for me to generate sort of that warm, fuzzy, you know, relative bodhicitta, that caring, that loving. Whereas if I put myself in that situation, you know, there's some things that we've got to work through before I can get to that point with myself, you know. So being able to start with a different point, and so that's something that I'd already kind of come upon for myself, and then reading that in the book, it was a real aha moment for me, you know, that finding a way to be able to generate that space and then move it to myself and work, have a relationship with sort of the resistance or the discomfort that can come from that, you know, and recognizing that's indicating that, you know, I'm very comfortable living in my own sort of self-cherishing narrative. But then when I try to move that to self-compassion, that's a really uncomfortable spot, and why that's the case, you know. But I find it a lot more fruitful for myself than trying to start with myself, you know. And so then we talked about, you know, sort of being able to reorient some of those different ideas and restructure, instead of the idea of reparenting, because, you know, I think some of us might be a little bit uncomfortable with throwing our parents under the bus, but the idea that, you know, that's not necessarily the relationship that we grew up with, as far as having an unconditional value that's not based upon performance, you know. And that I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with. You know, I know myself personally, I do. So being able to have that sort of that different starting point, to be able to move into that space, to get yourself to that place of genuine compassion and loving kindness, and then turning it onto yourself and being mindful of the experience that you're having when it gets to where it starts being a little bit rocky for you to sit in that space, you know. And then, yeah, like I think just came up in the chat too, that was part of our conversation as well, was the, you know, sort of the negative self-talk and the idea of the relationship of, you know, the metaphor of sort of putting that, you know, in the airplane, putting the oxygen mask on yourself before other people. And the idea, you know, you often hear you have to learn to love yourself before you can love others, or, you know, the idea of being self-compassionate before you can be compassionate to others, and how maybe that's not exactly the case. And there's a lot more nuance to that, but that ultimately, as practitioners, being able to engage with self-compassion skillfully and be able to actualize with that concept, then allows us to expand our capability of being compassionate and helpful to others. And that can be a motivating factor sometimes to walk into that, you know, that dark, murky cave of your own self-to-self relationship, because you're motivated by wanting to help others, because your compassion for others is genuinely true. But if you have to go through yourself to get there, you know, maybe you wouldn't do that if you didn't care so much about being able to help others. So I don't know, did I miss anything? If anybody else in my group feels like I breezed over something, please add on. Thank you.
Yeah, it looks like you were getting an A-OK from Patty there. So that's great. Very good. We have one group left, and it's the group with Andrea, John, Leatrice, and Luis. So Would anybody like to share from that group? All right, I'm gonna pick whoever's smiling the biggest. Let's see. John, would you like to share from your group?
Can I nominate Louise or Andrea because I'm just not feeling it tonight.
Okay. Who's gonna help John out?
I nominate Andrea.
So I was.
In the case of not it.
I don't know that I think I was more engaged in the conversation and having a spotty internet. So I'm not sure I could be great at reporting, you know, all that we had said. I do know we were getting kind of an interesting conversation about the first notion about the oxymoron being, you know, is self-compassion an oxymoron? And it kind of led us into a discussion about guilt. And then we were going back and forth a bit about that at the end. Because speaking for myself, I was very relieved that we didn't really have this concept in Buddhism. And then that kind of spurred some more discussion about it. And then we got cut off because our breakout room ended. But I think there was also a, you know, an acknowledgement of the self-critical nature that several of us related to having. That's that critical self-talk. And I know for me, the critical self-talk also equaled criticalness to other people. So there was kind of the both way streak there. But I think that would be a summary of our group. I don't know if anyone else would care to chime in, but there you have it.
I feel like I skipped a group. Is there another group that has not been represented yet? No?
That was it.
Oh, okay. There's a lot of really, really fruitful conversation there. One of the things that strikes me that I kind of want to make sure that we have time for our closing person, everything, and we're getting close to our time. But I want to bring your attention to page 44 if you have your book, and if not, it's okay. Because it struck me in the video when Thupten Jinpa said that 2 out of the 8 weeks of his program are devoted to self-compassion. That's like a quarter of the program devoted to self-compassion. And this is really interesting because for me, it raises the question, why do we need to focus so much on self-compassion? Why are we so lacking in self-compassion? And I don't know if you've had a chance yet to do the self-compassion test that Lama Matt put in our page for this week. But it's very eye-opening. I had done it a few years ago, and I did it again in preparation for tonight, and it was very eye-opening and thought-provoking. So if you haven't done it yet, I encourage you to try it. It doesn't take very long. So I'm wondering, why do we need to focus so much on self-compassion? Even His Holiness feels that this is kind of silly, right? Even a cat takes care of themselves. And for me, page 44 kind of gives me an answer to that, or one answer, and it's at the bottom where it says, it comes back to connection. And here's what Thupten Jinpa writes. He says, the 2 keys going forward, the things we can change, are how we define ourselves as individuals and the sense of connection we feel with others. Of course, the stronger our sense of separateness, the weaker our feeling of connection with others. And the less we feel connected with others, paradoxically, the less we feel connected with ourselves. We can end up disconnected from our own feelings, needs, and joys. it's just a few sentences, but I feel like there's so much there, because it makes sense to me that if self-compassion boils down to interconnectedness or being connected to others, then at a time when we are so disconnected from each other, when we feel so, especially when we play into and live into this myth of rugged individualism, and we are so disconnected from each other, it makes so much sense that we also would not have a sense of self-compassion, because they are so related. Being connected to others and having a healthy sense of self-compassion. And it made me think something a little silly to me, but I was like, oh, Sangha is one of the three jewels, but self is not, right? And so that kind of got me thinking, it does come down to connection. It comes down to how we relate to one another and how we relate to others, and ultimately how that affects how we relate to ourselves. So I wanted to share that, and as it's helpful to me and maybe helpful to you too. And if not, you can ignore it, but it does come back to self-connection, to connection with others. So when we think this is just selfish, or it feels funny to start with myself, or we might think I do have self-compassion, I have a good sense of self-esteem, to remember, well, let's remember that this is not selfish. It's about ultimately about practicing a sense of interconnectedness. So yes, before we move on to our closing prayers, I'm wondering if anybody has any final thoughts. Anybody perhaps that wanted to share something and didn't have a chance to. We have about 5 more minutes, so.
I just wanted to say you have a future as a professor writing essay questions.
Okay, well, thank you. That's very kind. I've really enjoyed reading this chapter. I look forward to spending the next few weeks together, practicing self-compassion and connectedness with one another. And I encourage you, if you haven't already, to take a few minutes to do either the rain meditation or the self-compassion test, or both. And one thing that really stood out to our group was the sense of allowing, really allowing these emotions to arise and for us to sit with them and be with them. So with that, oh, thank you, Lama Matt. Lama Matt just posted the link to the self-compassion test. So you can do it as soon as we finish our session tonight. If you like, just click on there. But
Just had one quick final thing. I did the rain meditation and yesterday, and one thing I noticed is as soon as I accepted something, I felt like I could change it. So that was an interesting revelation to me.
yeah. And thank you for that. And thank you to Masha Masha just posted also in the chat a link to an article on self-awareness. It sounds very interesting. So I'm going to click on that. You might want to click on it before we close the Zoom, because then it will go away. But Lama Matt, would you be kind enough to lead us in our closing prayers?
Actually, I'm going to add that self-awareness tool that Masha just shared to our Google site under the resources page, so that way people can come back to that at a later time if they want to. And again, I want to just make a quick technical note. So on our Google site, has anybody had any problems getting onto that? Okay. Last week we had a request for the guided meditations. And so as I was trying to find MP3s and things like that, I realized that Insight Timer has those kind of built-in guided meditations and so far the first 3 weeks have really tied in well with that Insight Timer. So I've embedded it into the Google site for the weekly resources. So each page has its corresponding Insight Timer guided meditation. They're slightly longer than 10 minutes. But if you use Insight Timer, you should be able to also pull it on your phone, so that way you don't have to be tied to your computer to listen to the meditation. So
Yeah, when I clicked on the link for the guided meditation through the Bodhisattva challenge page, it didn't really do anything.
Did you see the page itself? And I just, again, embedding things sometimes, you're kind of shooting for the moon here. Because I embedded it, like I'm looking at week 3s with the rain practice, and the play button is actually is kind of sitting on top of the title itself in the video. So I don't know if anybody else experienced your same issues, Derek.
Yeah, I'm not. Like I see the link for it, but it's not actually it's not a hyperlink for me.
Okay, well, it should play embedded into the page itself.
Nope.
Okay.
I mean, and keep in mind, I'm an idiot, so.
Well, and that's good. I mean, it's not good that you're an idiot, but I mean, it's
Derek,
good.
have you not been reading this chapter all week and
I know,
discussing with your
terrible
friends here?
Yeah, I got the book. I can read.
He's using it as a doorstop.
Fail. Not an idiot.
I sleep on it, and yeah.
So has anybody else tried to use it and come across?
Leslie found a shorter rain meditation on YouTube, also by, I think, Tara Brock. Is that correct? Yeah.
Well, and she's got SoundCloud. There's a lot on SoundCloud as well. But I wanted to try to have a resource that people could actually then we could, so we're not using like multiple formats for a thing. It just makes it easier. But maybe I'll put the link in there too, Derek, so that way you can just click on it and it should pop open the app. So I'll tweak it. So it's a work in progress.
I want to say it's a wonderful work in progress. Thank you so much for all the work you're putting into that. I've really enjoyed it. So thank you.
I echo that.
All right, so let me share my screen, and then we'll do our ending prayers. And so we're in these ending prayers. I just want to mention one of the words that we use in here. It says engendering bodhicitta, and for Buddhists, we at the Remay Center, we assume we know what bodhicitta is. But for those who may not have understanding of this word, bodhicitta means enlightened mind or awakened mind. And in the Buddhist tradition, the mind and the heart are the same. It's like I'm feeling, right? So a feeling is a mental process, but we always touch our heart. It's kind of that thing right there. So bodhicitta, not only just awakened mind, but also or awakened heart. That kind of spreading out, that kind of love and joy and compassion to self, and then radiating that out to others. So that's what is intended by this word bodhicitta. So I just wanted to share that real quick. And again, we'll just do this one time. Bodhicitta is precious. May it arise from whom it is not arisen. Once arisen, may it not diminish, but ever grow and flourish. Thank you, everybody. We are concluded. So next week, we will just continue on our next chapter, and I will be leading that discussion from fear to courage. So I look forward to the Dharma Talk Sunday and seeing you all next Wednesday.